Hi there, my name is Will Brannon, and I'm here to talk to you about some of our recent work exploring the effects of particular media, in this case, Twitter and talk radio, on the dynamics and content of the broader news cycle. This work was recently published in Scientific Reports. Let's start by discussing the question we want to answer. So we live in a time of rapid change in media. Both researchers and journalists often observe that the news cycle is speeding up and claim that new media are responsible. These claims go at least as far back as the development of cable news in the 1980s. Neil Postman noted at the time the rise of the "now this" culture in journalism, the idea that new media were decontextualizing and trivializing the news. Other work has observed that media business models are increasingly focused on tribalism and outrage, with roots in the 1980s media deregulation and the rise of talk radio. But, while both the 24-hour news cycle and outrage media have long histories, both of them are also often claimed to have accelerated with the coming of the internet, and particularly with social media. How much both of these effects are happening, and whether they're intensifying, are vital questions for civic life. If our media institutions have shorter attention spans, if their collective short-term memory has gotten smaller, we as a society forget issues more quickly. As we say, "now this," more and more often, mechanisms of democratic accountability may get weaker. Similarly, if outrage and negativity are intensifying as well, public debate gets more rancorous, and it may be harder to reach consensus. Knowing which media are driving these effects is also critical. The biases, priorities, and propensities for outrage, or not, of those media may be more influential if they get to go first in covering a story. And, because different media have and serve different audiences, there may be disparities between groups in society's ability to focus on those groups' priorities. We can't answer these questions here in full, but we can quantitatively test a shared presupposition. Is the news cycle, in its speed and in its content, actually different between different media in a way we can attribute to the media themselves? To compare social and traditional media at a manageable scale, we need proxies for each. To represent social media, we've looked at Twitter, recently renamed X, which is one of the most influential social media sites. We've compared it on the broadcast side to the oldest, furthest reaching, and still very influential traditional broadcast medium, talk radio. Both are highly impactful in their own right. Twitter because of its millions of users and a high concentration of journalists among those users, and radio because of its very wide reach. Nielsen finds that as many as 88% of Americans listen to radio weekly, and there's a long literature documenting its political influence, especially over conservatives. Both media host a mix of news and opinion, as is true of both broadcast and online journalism in general. With the recent sale of Twitter, this study is also timely. It's getting harder to observe journalists' interactions with each other on social media. Using data from the last period when this activity was concentrated and easy to observe, we can still provide a comprehensive investigation. We want to look at how the dynamics and life cycles of events differ between these two media. We define events here in a media-first, but also medium-agnostic way. An event is a subject of discussion and attention, rising to prominence in the discourse and then falling off. This definition captures the widest possible range of news, both clearly exogenous events and those driven by journalists' editorial choices. To clarify the terminology, we'll also refer to events as stories, while the individual tweets or speaker turns which make up an event are called items. By operationalizing an event as a collection of related tweets or radio statements, we can avoid relying on any medium-specific features like retweets or radio shows. This approach also lets us identify outrage and negativity in individual tweets or pieces of radio speech, which we can then group up to the event level. Concretely, we want to know how these events differ between media, both in terms of their life cycles and their patterns of negative or outraged affect. It's not entirely clear, though, what we should expect to see. At the start of stories, prior work and day-to-day experience suggest we should see Twitter discussion rise faster. On the falling side, there's been less research. Twitter stories might persist longer than radio and lead to a higher overall volume of discussion, or some might persist longer while most fade out even faster, or discussion on Twitter may uniformly decay more quickly than on radio. Similarly, we want to see if there are systematic differences in content, possibly driven by or related to these differences in story life cycles. Prior literature has considered and commented on the really extensive negativity and outrage in both Twitter and talk radio, but it hasn't clearly addressed the question of which we should expect to be more outraged. We want an apples-to-apples comparison of the two media and the ability to examine how negativity and outrage are distributed over a story's life cycle. Now, let's talk briefly about the data sets and methods we'll use to investigate these questions. We rely on 3 data sets, all of which cover 2-month periods in 3 consecutive years. One, which we'll call Elite Twitter, captures the discourse on Twitter of national journalistic and political elites, including nearly 2,900 journalists and politicians. We've collected all of their tweets, including retweets, quote tweets, and replies, to get a full picture of discussion. These users represent the commanding heights of journalism and politics, including members of Congress and the major national news outlets. The second dataset is a random sample from Twitter's fire hose of all tweets, including again retweets, quote tweets, and replies. We've restricted the data to only English tweets to get a good comparison with the other datasets. Including the fire hose lets us compare general Twitter users with elite journalists and helps pin down the effect of Twitter as a medium. Finally, we use a large dataset of talk and public radio broadcasts, which we collected from 228 stations around the United States and transcribed with OpenAI's Whisper model. To avoid double counting widely syndicated shows, we did deduplicate according to manually collected schedule information. To detect stories in these 3 corpora, we use the NewsLens algorithm. It begins with sentence embeddings of tweets or radio speaker turns, forms a graph whose edges represent semantically similar items that occur close together in time, and finally does Louvain community detection on this graph. This process, which was first developed in the literature for corpora of news articles, also produces high-quality and interpretable events for our corpora. We do one further post-processing step, excluding radio and fire hose events about non-news topics like Twitter memes or the weather, by checking for high enough cosine similarity to any elite event. To detect affect, we use a BART language model, fine-tuned for natural language inference, and ask it to assign scores for negativity, emotionality, and outrage to tweets or radio speaker turns. Manual inspection shows that there's good alignment between these and intuitive notions of affect. And now for results. We'll present a few results here, but there are lots of other robustness checks and subsidiary analyses in the paper. First, to give you a sense of what events look like, let's do a manual case study. We looked at Bernie Sanders' announcement that he was dropping out of the presidential race in April of 2020, and tracked discourse about it by counting mentions of keywords. The announcement happened at the vertical red line on all 3 plots. There's a striking pattern here. Discussion on Twitter both rises and falls faster than on radio. Firehose discourse is slower than elite discourse on both counts, but professional journalists on radio respond more slowly at the beginning and at the end of a story than the general public does in the firehose. So this is suggestive, but do we see similar patterns in a more systematic evaluation with the NewsLens events? Well, it turns out that we do. We've looked here at the within-event relative times of each piece of content in the elite Twitter and radio NewsLens events. For example, if a tweet that's part of an event happens exactly 3 minutes after the event starts with its first tweet or radio speaker turn, the relative time is 3 minutes or 180 seconds. The plot shows the empirical density and distribution of relative times by medium, where we've averaged up from the story level. As you can see, Elite Twitter, which is the red line, responds much faster than either Firehose Twitter or radio, with discussions spiking at the start of a story and rapidly falling off. By about 7 hours in, the average radio and Firehose stories have more ongoing discussion than the average Elite Twitter story does. Similarly, Firehose discussion also rises faster than radio discussion, which provides evidence of a medium-specific effect. On the falling end, there's a complication. Firehose discussion about COVID in March and April of 2020 behaved quite differently from discussion of other issues or at other times. It centered on personal experiences of the virus and countermeasures to it, persisting stably in the Firehose with only a loose tie to any specific news event. Newslen's detected stories here are quite long and fall off slowly. If we exclude them, using cosine similarity of story embeddings to a probe phrase about COVID, we find that other 2020 Firehose stories, and those from both 2019 and 2021, decay in the way we'd expect from the Sanders example, more slowly than Elite Twitter, but faster than radio. In other words, 2020 COVID discourse is the exception that proves the rule. Firehose discussion normally lags Elite Twitter and normally leads radio. For another perspective, we can look at the distribution of the within-event relative times for each medium as another way to summarize the average story's life cycle. Here, we've compared journalists to journalists, looking at Elite Twitter and radio. Looked at this way, it's easier to see that there is some overlap. Elite Twitter discussions are not entirely over by the time radio discussion picks up. Still, the average radio event starts more slowly than the average Elite Twitter event, and also decays more slowly, with a longer tail. Both the difference in means, which measure how late the center of mass of a story occurs, and the difference in standard deviations, which measure how spread out the stories are in time, are statistically significant. Finally, we can look at the second research question, whether there are affective biases in our corpora. As it turns out, there are. Twitter is systematically more negative and more outraged than radio. In fact, all three of our affect measures, negativity, emotionality, and outrage, show the same pattern. The Firehose is the most negative, followed by Elite Twitter, followed by radio. This pattern is consistent with the idea of medium-specific effects, as both Twitter corpora are consistently close to each other and further from radio. Given that there are interactions between journalists and their audiences online, it also suggests a possibility for future work. The idea of audience influence, that journalists on Twitter are more negative because of a feedback loop with the audience. We aren't limited to looking only at average levels of negativity and outrage, though. We can also look at how they're distributed over the average story's life cycle. These plots show the average level of negativity and outrage over a story's lifespan, along with the number of active stories contributing content at each point. The first, clearest thing to note is that a very small number of very long-lasting stories are high in outrage, and this behavior is consistent across media, though precisely how outraged they are varies between radio and Twitter. Over the bulk of stories which die out sooner than that, on the more densely populated left side of these graphs, there's a noticeable difference between radio and Twitter. On the radio, the level of outrage is pretty stable over time, in fact rising slightly, while on both Elite and Firehose Twitter it trends downward. The differences between media in these trends are also statistically significant. But this pattern leaves open an important question. Are the differences because of time trends within individual stories, or is it because of differences in how long more and less outraged stories last? The answer, based on linear models with and without story fixed effects, is that it is almost all about differences at the story level. Compared to pooled models without story fixed effects, Estimates of within-story time trends are generally not significant once we add story fixed effects and have much smaller magnitudes. Differences between media are also not significant once we include story fixed effects. Radio and Twitter, that is, differ in how hospitable they are to outraged and negative stories, leading to differences in the distribution of affect over time. So, what have we learned here? First, that news cycles are very different between media. Twitter is systematically faster than radio on both the rising and falling ends of a story. But news cycle speed is not the only thing that differs. Affective biases do too. Twitter is systematically more negative and more outraged than radio, especially in the firehose. Our results provide, as far as we know, the first large-scale comparison of outrage and negativity between Twitter and traditional media. Overall, Twitter shrinks the media's collective attention span, with events not persisting as long in the discourse as they do in older media. This finding may help explain recent media history, but it also makes predictions for the future. The more journalism moves online and into social media, especially Twitter, but perhaps other social sites as well, the more we might expect to see it speed up and forget more quickly, with implications for political culture and democracy. There are also some clear directions for future work. We might want to know what aspects of Twitter, from general platform design to the recommendation algorithm, make it forget more quickly. The origin of the negativity bias is also important and deserves attention. Our work particularly raises the prospect of an environment with fast news cycles that selects, in a Darwinian fashion, for more engaging perspectives, which, because outrage is engaging, are more likely to be outraged. Finally, it's worth investigating whether Twitter biases leak out to other media. Does Twitter, by discussing stories first, cause changes in coverage in other media like radio? And that's it. Thanks for following along. There's much more where that came from, though, so please do check out the paper. If you have comments, questions, or want to work together, please get in touch.